It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world. That was the first US President George Washington delivering his farewell address. For most part of its early history, US presidents shielded the nation from international affairs, the fear being the negative consequences of involving the US in Europe's power conflicts. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we trace the history and progression of the United States towards becoming a global superpower. The focus of the early American leaders was to develop the nation's economy and expand domestic territory. And they viewed the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans as invaluable barriers that would allow the US to grow free of foreign interference. But Europe had a presence in the Americas, and the United States was worried about that. In the 1820s, the US GDP was a mere 2% of the global GDP. So the US lacked the economic might, and coupled with a lack of military strength, the concern about Europe's presence in the Americas was very genuine. So in 1823, US President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, which attempted to warn Europe against meddling in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine had 4 basic points. Number 1, the United States would not interfere in the internal affairs of or the wars between European powers. Number 2, the United States recognized and would not interfere with existing colonies and dependencies in the Western Hemisphere. Number 3, the Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization. And number 4, any attempt by a European power to oppress or control any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the US. So in essence, President James Monroe was telling Europe, we'll stay out of your business and you stay out of ours. But as I mentioned before, at this time, the United States lacked both the economic and the military might. So how did it expect Europe to take the Monroe Doctrine seriously? The answer? Great Britain. More than the US, it was Great Britain who was primarily concerned about the ambitions of primary European powers like Spain and Russia in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine was initially supposed to be a joint declaration between the US and Great Britain to the other European powers. But Secretary of State John Quincy Adams argued that the US needed to communicate the Monroe Doctrine as an exclusive statement of American foreign policy. Nonetheless, Great Britain and its strong navy ensured that its economic interests were left untouched in the region and in turn ensured compliance towards the Monroe Doctrine. Though not of much relevance in the 1820s, the Monroe Doctrine actually went on to become a cornerstone of American foreign policy towards the end of the 19th and the early part of the 20th centuries. By 1860, close to the start of the Civil War, the American North was well on its way towards a commercial and manufacturing economy. The Industrial Revolution had come to America, and the North was taking full advantage of an abundance of natural resources. By 1860, 90% of the nation's manufacturing output came from the northern states. Only 40% of the northern population was still engaged in agriculture as compared to 84% of the South. And this industrial advantage over the South was a key factor in North's victory during the Civil War. But after the Civil War, the US economy really took off. And there were 2 key industries that steered the US economy towards becoming globally competitive. And these industries were steel and railways. Several tariffs were imposed during the course of the 19th century to protect the US steel industry, and these helped tremendously in introducing innovation in the production and distribution of steel within the United States. In 1860, the US produced 13,000 tons of steel, but within 50 years, in 1910, the US was the top steel producer in the world at over 24 million tons annually. The first transcontinental railroad was completed in May of 1869, marking the first continuous rail line across the United States. And this is important because the railways were a powerful, inexpensive, and consistent form of transportation, which helped accelerate the development of virtually every other industry in the United States. By 1890, rail lines covered nearly every corner of the United States, bringing raw materials to industrial factories and finished goods to the consumer markets. In a span of 50 years, between 1820 and 1870, the US contribution to the world GDP rose from 2% to approximately 18%. With this growth in steel, the US Navy too shifted from wooden to steel-hulled warships. And with increased budgets and improved naval training, the US Navy slowly transformed into a formidable power by the end of the 19th century. Still, the US continued to avoid showing any interest or exercising its power on the world stage. However, there was one significant milestone that happened in 1854. The Treaty of Kanagawa, signed in March of 1854, was the first treaty between the United States and Japan, and it opened Japan to trade and foreign relations with the United States. Now, this is significant because of two reasons. One, with this treaty, Japan ended a 2 centuries long period of self-isolation. And two, it was accomplished by a combination of diplomacy and military might. US Commodore Matthew Perry landed at Tokyo Bay with a fleet of American warships, which ultimately pressured the Japanese government into agreeing to the US terms. The real milestone, though, towards the transformation of the US into a global power came near the end of the 19th century with the Spanish-American War of 1898. The basis of the war was the Cuban struggle for independence from Spain. The US had monetary interests in Cuba, but the more important factor here was the appeal to the American humanitarian sentiment in support of the Cubans. When US President William McKinley sent an ultimatum to Spain in March of 1898 to free Cuba, Spain was completely caught off guard. It was not ready for a war with the United States, nor was it ready to surrender Cuba. So while diplomatic maneuvering was going on across the globe to influence the US not to go to war with Spain, in April of 1898, the USS Maine, a US battleship which had been stationed in the Havana harbor since February, exploded and sank, killing 266 American sailors. The US blamed Spain and officially declared war in April of 1898. The United States Navy fought the Spaniards on two fronts, winning the Battle of Manila Bay in May of 1898 and the US Atlantic Fleet destroying Spain's naval presence in the Caribbean at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba in July of 1898. Subsequently, the Treaty of Paris was signed on December 10, 1898, formally ending the Spanish-American War. But as part of it, Cuba was officially recognized as an independent nation. Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. It also ceded the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The US emerged from the war as an acknowledged world power, and the London Times summed it up with this quote: "In future, America will play a part in the general affairs of the world, such as she has never played before." And all of a sudden, the Monroe Doctrine, which had been gathering dust for decades, became relevant. And subsequently, in 1904, President Teddy Roosevelt contributed an addendum which stated that in cases of flagrant and chronic wrongdoing by a Latin American country, the United States could intervene in that country's internal affairs. So after establishing itself as a global power, the US continued to be measured in its interference in global affairs. And this was evident between 1914 and 1917, when the United States refrained from entering World War I. But in 1917, the US finally entered World War I, primarily because of two reasons. One, because Germany had sunk US ships in the Atlantic, which threatened both American lives and business interests. And second, the British intercepted a secret message between Germany and Mexico, known as the Zimmermann Telegram, where Germany promised Mexico a part of US territory in exchange for providing support to Germany during World War I. There was also a third reason, which is not often discussed, and that was financial. The US banks were worried that if the US did not participate in World War I, they would lose vast sums of money which they had invested in Britain and France if the Allies lost in World War I. The US entered World War I on April 6, 1917, and immediately helped turn the tide in favor of the Allies. And when the war ended, the US was invited to play a leading role in the peace talks that concluded with the Treaty of Versailles. And US President Woodrow Wilson displayed his vision of the future. In his 1918 14-point speech, Woodrow Wilson called for imperialism to be dismantled, nation-states be given the option for self-determination, and most important of all, he proposed the creation of a new international organization dedicated to peaceful diplomacy and collective security, the precursor to the United Nations, the League of Nations. Unfortunately, due to several reasons, the US suddenly went into a period of isolation immediately after World War I. The primary reason was the massive cost that the US incurred, both financially and from a human lives perspective. So both the American public and the US Congress preferred that the US stay out of the affairs of Europe. And without the support and participation of the United States, the League of Nations could not be effective. So it is often debated if World War II could have been prevented if the US had played a more effective role in global politics after World War I. Economically, though, the US continued to expand and protect its interests in Latin America. And during this period of isolation, there was talk by the US, but very little action. For example, when Japan invaded Manchuria and tried to expand its control over Northeast China in 1931, US President Herbert Hoover and his Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, established the Stimson Doctrine, which stated that the US would not recognize the territory gained by aggression and in violation of international agreements. But there was no commitment from the US with respect to direct involvement or intervention in the conflict. When FDR took office in 1933, he tried to steer the US towards more active participation in international affairs, but the isolationist sentiment in US Congress continued to prevail. Even as tensions rose in Europe over Nazi Germany's aggressive maneuvers, Congress pushed through a series of neutrality acts which served to prevent American ships and citizens from becoming entangled in these conflicts. FDR was disappointed at this neutrality stance, but acquiesced because he needed congressional support for his New Deal policies to get the US out of the economic depression. And this isolation continued till that fateful day of December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 2,400 troops were killed in this attack, and all of a sudden, the entire country was unified behind joining World War II. And a day later, the US declared war against Japan and subsequently joined the war on the European front against Germany and Italy. At the time the US entered World War II, Adolf Hitler's Germany had enjoyed a series of military successes. France had surrendered after just 6 weeks of fighting, while the Soviet Union, which had previously signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, was engulfed in a surprise attack from Germany, while Britain was completely isolated and outnumbered. But when the first US troops landed in Europe in early 1942, the tide slowly began to shift against the Axis powers. Germany found itself caught between a Soviet counteroffensive in the east and a US-led offensive in the west. And the secret behind this turnaround was the US industry retooling itself to focus on the war effort, which led to US troops gradually building an advantage in the air and with respect to ground combat. Before the start of the war, FDR had called for the United States to serve as an arsenal of democracy. And American industry stepped up to meet the challenge with US factories that were built to mass produce automobiles, retooling to churn out airplanes, engines, guns, and other supplies at unprecedented rates. And this rate of production was so unprecedented that by late 1943 and early 1944, the US was manufacturing almost as many munitions as all of its allies and enemies combined. And the US economy, which had been reeling under the Great Depression, started witnessing growth as Americans were put back to work to support the World War II effort. Unemployment, which had reached 25% during the Great Depression and hovered at 14.6% in 1939, dropped to 1.2% by 1944. Through the course of the war, the United States established itself as a strong military power. But it were its post-World War II actions that established the US as the leader of the free world. And the leadership was established across 3 key areas: the military, economics, and finance. Starting in 1944, when the war was in its final stages, government representatives from around the world met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to set up a new monetary system that would encourage international trade after the war was over. The US had realized and influenced the rest of the world that the path to long-lasting peace was not through tariffs and economic blockade, but through an open trade and financial system. In 1930, during the period of isolation, US President Herbert Hoover had approved the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which had increased import duties to their highest levels since 1830. America's main trading partners had quickly retaliated with new tariffs of their own, and by 1933, international commerce had virtually come to a standstill, and that had worsened the economic depression. So, emerging out of World War II, the whole world was shifting to a new paradigm: open trade and greater global cooperation, and the United States was leading the way. So the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 met for this very specific purpose and conceived 3 key international bodies: the World Bank, the IMF, and GATT, which was the forerunner to the WTO. But the most important decision coming out of the Bretton Woods Conference, which would have a huge global implication and establish the US as the undisputed leader of this new world, was the choice of the US dollar as the global currency, which meant that the US dollar became the most credible currency in the world, so much so that countries across the globe started maintaining dollar reserves and exchanging their currencies for a set dollar exchange rate. And the biggest impact of the US dollar being the world currency has been on the political and the diplomatic side, since it has provided the United States with significant leverage when negotiating with non-friendly governments. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Per the 2024 Global Terrorism Index report, 2 countries are rated as having a very high impact from terrorism. Which are these 2 countries? Burkina Faso and Israel, with an 8+ terrorism impact score, are labeled as having a very high impact from terrorism. So the answer is A, Burkina Faso and Israel. Question for the current episode. Which American company transitioned from building machine guns and B-29 propeller assemblies during World War II to home appliances like washer dryers and dishwashers after World War II? Was it A, Kenmore, B, Frigidaire, C, Whirlpool, or D, Sunbeam? Once again, which American company transitioned from building machine guns and B-29 propeller assemblies during World War II to home appliances like washer dryers and dishwashers after World War II? Was it A, Kenmore, B, Frigidaire, C, Whirlpool, or D, Sunbeam? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. We meet again in 2 weeks with another interesting and exciting episode related to world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.